My name is Weldon Watson, and I started at WKY-TV in April of 1974 and worked until November of 1978, 4.5 years. And it was the launching pad for my career for the rest of my life. It really had something to do with everything else that I have done really since working for WKY. It was a great place to work. I left there, went to work for OG&E for 2 years, then worked at Oklahoma Natural Gas for 5 years, and then went to the parent of Oklahoma Natural Gas, One Oak, and became an officer of the company, retired, and then went to the legislature, the public service time of my life. And everything that I did, I can tie back to my experience at WKY. I'm so grateful for that experience, that opportunity of being there. WKY was a family, really. It was a tremendous group of people, and the only thing I regret is that I don't have time to mention every name of everyone who had some influence on me during that period of time. But one of the things I think that reflects the family atmosphere that we had was when I left in 1978, I got a handmade card by Arnie Katoff. And it's a beautiful card that I have put in a frame and keep in my office at home. And I was going off to OG&E, and he did this artwork of a Ready Kilowatt character and had a big arrow pointing to the Corporation Commission, which regulated OG&E. And then everybody that was available to go up to the kitchen for a piece of cake, and of course everybody showed up because they got the opportunity to get a piece of cake that Imogene had made, everybody signed that card. And that is a wonderful memento of that time, and also a reflection of the family-like atmosphere that existed at WKY. It was really tremendous. Among the personalities that were there that stand out, and again, I can't mention everybody, but Norman Bagwell was the general manager at the time. I remember when I first started to work, in the first week, I stopped by McDonald's to get a sausage biscuit. I walk in and Norman Bagwell's in line. I go up to him. I had met him just briefly, and I went up, shook hands with him, and reminded him who I was. And he invited me to sit down with him and gave me the top half of his sausage biscuit that morning and asked me about where I came from, and we got to know each other better. And that was typical of the relationship that you had with everybody, the very top people. Everybody there at the station was very much interested in you and who you were, and there was an atmosphere of excellence. And part of that was revealed. You could see it through Lee Allen Smith, for example. At that time, he was the assistant manager. Mr. Bagwell passed away later during the period of time that I was there, and Lee Allen Smith became manager and really had a very creative approach to television, and was one of the primary drivers of the Stars and Stripes show that WKY did, that was broadcast nationwide on NBC. And a very powerful personality and a wonderful guy to work for. Also at that time, of course, Ernie Schultz had been there forever, and he was the director of information, and he was the lead dog. There's absolutely no doubt about that in the newsroom. As director of information, he had the news department, the sports department, the weather department, and the farm department, all reported to Ernie. I remember one morning I was single and I overslept, and the alarm didn't go off or something, and I got this phone call from Ernie Schultz, and I pick up the phone. It's Ernie, and he said, "Weldon, are you going to come to work today?" I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, Ernie, I've overslept. I didn't realize I'd overslept. I'll be there in a few minutes." He said, "Well, if you can't, I can find somebody to replace you." Click, buzz. And that was Ernie. That was his personality, a very strong personality, but also a focus on excellence in the newsroom. And Jack Ogle was actually the news director, at that time, and he was a very laid-back personality. We used to laugh in the newsroom and say that if you wanted to get a yes answer, you could go to Jack. If you wanted to get a no answer, you could go to Ernie. But they were wonderful people and great mentors for all of us in the newsroom. Jack Ogle also gave me some advice when I left to cover the legislature. He had covered the legislature for many years, and he gave me some advice as I went out the door and told me, he said, you know, legislators are some of the finest people that I know, and they're very easy people to get to work with and to be around. And he said, quite frankly, I'd much rather be with a group of legislators than with a group of businessmen. And I found that to be true, and it was a great atmosphere, and I enjoyed covering the legislature. He also gave me a history book, an Oklahoma history book, and inside the cover of that book, it said, "To Jack Ogle, from J.D. McCarty." And J.D. McCarty was the old Speaker of the House back in the early days in Oklahoma. And that was a reflection of the relationship that Jack had with the legislative leadership during the years that he covered the legislature. I started in television in Ada, Oklahoma at K10. When I was in television back in those days, in television news, you really couldn't be hired in Tulsa or Oklahoma City at the larger stations because we didn't have any TV experience. I was a graduate of the University of Oklahoma Journalism School, but yet I did not qualify to go to work at those stations. I had to get some experience. So at that time, there were just a few places you could go to get TV experience. Ada, Oklahoma, Lawton, Oklahoma, Wichita Falls, Texas had 2 television stations. Wichita, Kansas had a couple of stations. Hays, Kansas had a station. So I went around, visited all of those stations, and got a call from Wichita, Kansas, and from Ada, Oklahoma. I went to Ada, Oklahoma because I knew something about Oklahoma news and had been around Oklahoma all my life, and so I felt much more comfortable in covering news in Oklahoma than I thought I would be in Kansas. And it was at Channel 10 in Ada that I first met up with Ray Vaughn. Ray and I were there. The station was owned by a gentleman called Bill Hoover, named Bill Hoover, and we affectionately referred to it as the Hoover School of Broadcasting. East Central State University was located there in Ada, and the station was run primarily by students. But there were some great WKY employees who came from the Hoover School of Broadcasting, and it included one of the finest, a fellow named Bill Thrash, and Charles Stacy also worked there, and there's probably several others who I did not really know their history, but at least those 4, myself, Vaughn, Thrash, Stacy, all worked at the Hoover School of Broadcasting in Ada, Oklahoma, and we were able to go from there to go to work at larger stations. I went to Tulsa, went to work at Channel 2. Ray Vaughn left, went to work in Wichita Falls, Texas, and then went out to Phoenix. Then he came back to Oklahoma City to work at WKY, and he also was going to law school. He was doing the weekend news, and they had an opening at WKY in the newsroom, and Ray Vaughn calls me in Tulsa and he says, "Weldon, you need to get down here to WKY. It's the best station in Oklahoma, and you really need to get down here. And there's an opening, and you need to call Ernie Schultz." And I did. And of course, Ernie required, as he did everyone at that time, I had to go out and shoot some film. Fortunately, having worked in Ada, Oklahoma, I knew how to do everything. I could process film, I could shoot film, I could edit film, I could do everything. So I was able to send a piece of film that I was able to put together and send to him for him to look, and that was part of what Ernie required in those days. He wanted to make sure that if you were a television reporter, you knew something about the visual aspect of television, and that was very important. He placed a very high emphasis on the visual aspect. As a matter of fact, my title, and all of us as reporters, our title was reporter photographer. And that's because we had to be capable of doing both of those in working in a television newsroom for Ernie Schultz. I think I may have been a little different than most people who worked in the newsroom in the sense that I really enjoyed being a reporter and really wasn't that interested in being a photographer, and most of the time I did reporting and not photography, and enjoyed doing that. When I first got to the station, I worked at City Hall, covered City Hall. I liked beat reporting. I think there's an old photograph that I have that was actually shot in the old television newsroom by Johnny Shannon, and it showed me seated at the old news table there, and I'm looking at a newspaper, and that was part of what I enjoyed doing, was keeping up with everything that was happening in Oklahoma. One of the ways you did that, of course, was keep current with the newspaper, and at that time we had the Oklahoma City Times and the Daily Oklahoman, the Tulsa World, the Tulsa Tribune, and I would read all four of those papers every day, and included in that was the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal, you know, everything is in the Wall Street Journal if you have the time to read it. That was always the problem. But I loved being a reporter, and I covered City Hall. Patience Latting was the mayor at that time, the first female mayor of Oklahoma City, and it was a great experience. I went from there out to the Capitol. Dick Nelson had been covering the House, and Pam Henry covered the Senate. And we covered the Capitol like a blanket back in those days. Oliver Murray was out there with us most of the time. Oliver had been out there about 10 years before Pam and I got out there, and so everybody really knew Oliver Murray better than they knew us as reporters. But it was a great experience, great opportunity to really get to know Oklahoma, and I really enjoyed doing that. It was about this time that I met my wife, and really that was the greatest thing that happened to me during my years at WKY. And it did have a very powerful impact on me, but I was working weekend. I was working with Ray Vaughn, and Ray was also in my wedding. And typical of Ray Vaughn, I got married on a Saturday, so he brought a camera to the wedding and shot film with the old 16mm Bell & Howell camera of the wedding ceremony, or not the ceremony itself, but the reception afterwards. And then at 6 o'clock that night, he puts it on television. And of course, he had to wear a tuxedo and had this god-awful pink shirt on that, you know, was part of the tuxedo. And he actually did the news that night in that tuxedo, and showed some film of our wedding reception. I was making, at that time in the newsroom, I was making $16,000 a year, and it was only after I got married that it suddenly dawned on me for the first time in my life, I'm going to have to make a living. And it was at that time that I began looking at public relations jobs. And news people at that time considered going to public relations going to the dark side. So, but I began looking and had looked around at Kerr-McGee. At that time, City Service Gas was headquartered in Oklahoma City. I'd looked at several energy companies like that, some manufacturing companies, different ones there in Oklahoma City that had public relations departments, and had not been successful. But Brad Edwards, by this time we had moved into the new newsroom, and we had cubicles, and my cubicle was right next to Brad Edwards. And one day Brad leans around from his cubicle, comes around to my side of the cubicle and said, "Weldon, are you still interested in a public relations job?" And I said, "You bet." And he said, "Well, I understand that George Cannon at OG&E is looking for somebody to go to work, and he wants somebody from media." And so that was on a Tuesday, and I didn't call from the station, but I went home and I called George Cannon at home, and he said, "Well, let's have lunch at the Petroleum Club on Thursday." And I sat down with George, and he hired me. I think one of the reasons that he hired me was that I had covered a story on a utility investigation that had been made during the interim at the legislature, and they were very interested in looking at all of the advertising that was being done by OG&E and ONG. And Mr. Bagwell was subpoenaed to actually go and take all of the information concerning the amount of money that both utilities had paid for advertising, and I had covered those stories. And George Cannon liked my coverage and felt that I was a very objective type of person and understood the business aspect of what the utilities were trying to do. And there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that that helped me get hired at OG&E. Brad had a great sense of humor. I remember one day he and I were out on a story together. Brad was a photographer, I was the reporter, and he was driving the car, and we stopped at a stoplight, and there was some kids that were standing there, and they were wanting some money, and Brad rolled down the window, and the kid walks up to the window and he says, we're collecting money here to help young children find Jesus. And Brad pauses and looks at him and said, "Oh, I didn't know he was lost." Back in those days when we covered the legislature, the stations sent out two reporters, one to cover the House, one to cover the Senate. Pam Henry covered the Senate, I covered the House. And Pam was put up in a press gallery, which was above the floor of the chamber, and it was enclosed, and so she could sit up there with her fellow reporters and laugh and cut up. But over on the House side, we were on the floor. We were actually on the south side. We were restricted to that south side of the dais where the speaker is up at the front of the chamber. We were restricted to the south side, and when I say we, I'm talking about the television stations, the 3 television stations. On the other side of the dais, on the north side, the newspapers and the wire services had a table, and they all sat over there. And we would sit, or would stand and actually sit there. We had chairs, and we could roll our cameras into the chamber, but we were restricted to that one little area right up at the front of the chamber. But because I was at WKY, which started in 1949, we had the first chair. And then the second chair was KWTV, the third chair was KOCO. We started first, so we got the first chair, and we were able to plug into the sound system there. Well, that first row of desks was right there against the wall on the south side, and my chair was right next to the first desk. And there was a representative there named Don Duke from Ardmore, Oklahoma. And I literally would sit there all afternoon, and I could actually put my elbow on Don's desk right next to the buttons that he pushed to vote. And so it was not unusual for Don to have to leave and go talk to a constituent or to a lobbyist. And when he would leave, he would always punch me on the arm and he'd say, "Weldon, vote me aye on this next bill." And I would sit there, and when the vote came up, if Don had not returned, I would reach over and push the button and vote. And so I have since told members that I may well be the only member of the legislature who had voted several times before I was elected. I have an old photo that a friend took of me on the floor of the Capitol during the time that I was a reporter there. And Jack Combs is actually in the picture. He was a photographer, and Jack's looking across the way, and I'm actually working on the film camera and changing the film. And Jack is looking across the way. In those days, they had benches around the dais, and that's where the pages would sit. And old Jack obviously was looking at some female high school page over there and was making eyes at her, and there I was changing the film in the camera because I did most of the shooting of the debate on the floor. And it was really very difficult because we only had about 3 minutes of film in those little small film reels that we used to shoot the legislature, and so I had to know who the best debater was and try to focus, because the best footage that you could get was the actual footage on the floor. If I missed it, we would have to take them out into the hall and shoot them out there. But again, because of Ernie, as a reporter, I had to know how to shoot film, and I did shoot film and shot all the debate film on the floor, even though we had a photographer, and the photographer really would just run the camera back and forth between myself and Pam. Working at WKY gave me a wealth of experience about the state of Oklahoma that was so helpful in my later career. I learned a lot about agriculture. In Tulsa, we did not cover agriculture. We didn't have a farm department. I got over to Oklahoma City to WKY. They had a farm department. Russell Pearson, Ken Root, and we would, in the newsroom, we would pick up the custom cutters of wheat that would move into the state of Oklahoma in the spring, and we would literally pick them up at the Red River and take them all the way up to Medford, Oklahoma, all the way up the state. As the custom cutters would move through the state, we'd have a wheat story every week. Why? Because agriculture was important to the state of Oklahoma. That's one of the big differences too. When I came to WKY, in Tulsa, at the television station I worked at there, they used a staff announcer to do the weather. And they would give him a book that they picked up at TGNY that talked about the weather. And you could buy one on birds, you could buy one on trees, and they had one on weather. And they would give that to the staff announcer and tell him to learn something about weather. And then we got maps there at the station from the Weather Bureau, and he could take those maps and then draw fronts and things like that on the weather board and do about a minute and a half of weather, and that was the way they covered weather at most stations at that time. I come down to Oklahoma City to WKY, and they had 3 weathermen, and all of them were meteorologists, and they prepared their own forecasts and did not rely on the Weather Bureau to produce a forecast for them. So it was really quite amazing, and again, typical of the quality and the focus on excellence that we got at WKY. And it was also a reflection on E.K. Gaylord. He knew that agriculture was important to the economy of Oklahoma, and there's nothing more important to agriculture than the weather. And so that was why there was so much emphasis on weather. I also learned something about energy I'll never forget, and it was a typical Ernie Schultz story. Out in western Oklahoma, back when Henry Bellman was in the Senate, William Simon was what they called the energy czar at that time. This was in the Nixon administration. I think he was the energy czar in the Nixon and the Ford administration. He had been Secretary of the Treasury as well and signed all of our currency. But William Simon was brought out to western Oklahoma by Henry Bellman to get on one of the deep rigs that were being drilled. The deep wells were being drilled out in western Oklahoma in what was called the Anadarko Basin. And I'll never forget, Ernie and I flew out there, again typical of Ernie Schultz. Ernie was the photographer, I was the reporter. We went out and crawled all over one of those huge rigs that was capable of drilling down 30,000 feet to hit that massive gas formation down deep in the earth. They had never been able to do that before, and quite frankly, they really didn't have rigs to do that. Parker Drilling out of Tulsa was able to come up with a huge rig, the first one that had ever been built to do that kind of deep drilling. And it was the equivalent of, for example, standing on a 5-story building and taking a needle and thread and dropping that needle down to the ground and actually drilling a hole in the ground with that needle. That was comparable to what they were doing with the technology of that day of drilling deep wells. And it was really great to be out on a rig with William Simon, he was known as the energy czar. Today it's called the Secretary of Energy. They didn't have a Secretary of Energy at that time. He was the energy czar for the Nixon administration and the Ford administration. Again, Ernie Schultz went out there with me. We flew out there in his old tail dragger, the old Cessna 150 that he had, circa 1953, probably somewhere like that. Flew out there, shot that story, got it back to the station, and we were able to get it on the air at 6 o'clock and at 10 o'clock that night. Another great energy story for me that was very helpful when I went to Oklahoma Natural Gas, because at Oklahoma Natural Gas we had our own exploration production company, not only the utility, but we also had an exploration and production company, because back in the day people didn't want to drill gas wells, and the only way they would do it is work with ONG, so we had to have an exploration and production company. I learned a lot about the business at WKY. I'll never forget one Christmas. Ernie liked to do series during the Christmas break because there really wasn't a lot happening during the Christmas holiday. So he asked me one time to do a series on the old Oklahoma City oil field. And the old discovery well was the Mary Sudick well, which was located, discovered out in southeast Oklahoma City. And I interviewed, we were able to find the old landman who had actually made the contract with the Sudick family to drill that well. Also did an interview with George Shirk, who was a former mayor of Oklahoma City. George Shirk, as a boy, had ridden his bicycle out to the well the day that it was discovered, and it was blowing oil all over the place, and he was very descriptive, describing how that oil would float back, and then he got oil all over his clothes and all over his bicycle, and he was very excited about being there that day. It was 1928 when that happened. And also E.K. Gaylord has said that that was the reason that he started WKY radio. It wasn't something that was real popular. There weren't a whole lot of radios at that time, but he thought with the discovery of oil there was going to be more and more information coming out of Oklahoma, and it was at that time that E.K. Gaylord decided that he wanted to get into broadcasting, very, very early in broadcasting, and that's when he bought and started WKY radio. One of the great things I had the opportunity to do at the Capitol as a member of the legislature, I had a good friend who's now termed out, Bill Nations, Representative Nations from Norman. And I discovered that Bill had done the stats for Bob Berry on all the basketball games for like 25 years, the OU basketball games. And so he had worked with Bob for about 25 years. Well, I'd worked with Bob for about 4.5. And Bob was a wonderful, wonderful person. When I got married, I'll never forget his lovely wife, Joan. I know it wasn't Bob, it was his wife, Joan. They gave us a silver serving spoon for our wedding. And to this day, we still use that serving spoon at Thanksgiving and at Christmas. But I had the opportunity in talking to Bill Nations, Representative Nations from Norman. I talked to him and I said, you know, we need to honor Bob. He had been in the business doing sports, broadcasting, football for TU, for OSU, for OU for 50 years. I said, you know, we really need to bring him to the House and do a citation and honor him and let him speak to the members for a few minutes. And Bill agreed, and Bill talked to Bob Berry Jr., and we were able to get Bob to come to the House. We had the citation, and it's amazing. The one thing about the State House is that when you're on the floor of the State House, you are never as close to the people of Oklahoma as you are on that floor, because there's one of every 37,000 people from Oklahoma right there present before you. And Bob Berry gets up and does his bit, has a lot of humor, typical Bob Berry type stuff. And after he finished, the audience, the members of the House stood up and gave him a standing ovation that went on for about 5 minutes, and it really choked Bob up. He had the citation, and I remember he put it up like this because he was trying to hide his face because he was beginning to break up. But it really was very meaningful for him and very meaningful for Bill Nations and myself, who both had great respect for Bob Berry, a wonderful, wonderful broadcaster and typical of the excellence that we had at WKY. I will always be grateful for my experience at WKY. It really was my launching pad. I'll be forever indebted to my close personal friend, Ray Vaughn, who actually was responsible for me coming to work at WKY, and I followed Ray. He served in the legislature, and that was one of the reasons I thought I might like to do that kind of service as well. But all of the people at WKY were tremendous, and it was really an institution, and it was the greatest television station in the United States at that particular time, and I think it was the height of television during the time that I was there. It was before the cable television channels started, and people didn't have a choice at that time but to watch one of the three stations at 6 and 10. And it was a very, very powerful television station, a wonderful family atmosphere, and I'm so grateful for that experience because it had a tremendous impact on me. Even though I was just there 4.5 years, it had a tremendous impact on my life, and the success that I have had in my life I attribute to those days at WKY.